Hey everyone, it's been over 2 minutes and I haven't been raped yet. And neither was the trans activist I'm going to be addressing today. Hi everyone, I'm Davison. Now, last week I did a video challenging trans activists because they're denying the science that shows us that they don't actually have the right brain and the wrong body. They're not actually a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body. And to say so is just ridiculous. We should stop lying about it, mostly because they're lying to themselves, they're lying to the public, and they're also starting to infect the brains of children with this nonsense. Also, as Milo Yiannopoulos points out on the Joe Rogan show,
I mean, this is the problem with the trans project. It's profoundly sexist because, you know, the trans and homophobic, by the way, because, oh, you must have really supposed to have been a girl. No, they're just gay. And if you leave these kids alone, all the evidence suggests that they grow up into perfectly well-adjusted young gay men.
And that's what Danni Askini, a trans activist in Seattle, was. He was a gay boy.
Folks who used to be gay, used to identify as gay, transitioning into trans women.
Folks who used to be gay.
You're a man in a dress.
Yes, Danni is a man in a dress spreading misinformation about the transgender movement, but also about rape. So that's why I've chosen Danni for my subject today, because one of the things I do is expose false rape accusations. They happen a lot more often than people want to admit. Specifically, Danni's done this to a vulnerable member of his own community.
Creating a loving and supporting community of friends, which is what I tend to consider Gender Justice League. It's a collection of my friends, and we work together to create culture change.
So let's find out how Danni treats his close friends. Meet Frank Reese. Frank was working at Microsoft, a great job, but quit that job after 3 months of dating Danni because Danni had to undergo cancer treatment, a form that usually kills. Frank spent a year nursing Danni back to health. Frank is a bisexual man who was in the US on a green card, so he was a fairly vulnerable person at the time. For those interested, bisexuals actually suffer the highest levels of domestic and sexual violence. So Frank returned to his job at Microsoft, promptly put Danni onto his medical plan as his partner, and ends up paying for hair transplant surgery, breast augmentation, and bought Danni a car so that Danni could travel back and forth from Portland to Seattle. Basically, the bits and pieces of woman that you see today were bought and paid for by Frank Reese. Danni was financially abusing Frank while cheating on him and endlessly gaslighting whenever he got caught. It wasn't Danni's infidelity that was the problem, it was that Frank was spying on him. It was Frank who needed therapy. The only thing Danni was ever afraid of was that the money supply would dry up. Danni first threatened to file a protection order because when they broke up, Frank started packing some of Danni's things to move out. Danni used that threat to keep complete control, asking to remain on Frank's medical plan and getting Frank to pay for first and last month's rent, as well as co-signing for the lease. You see, the breakup actually happened because Frank refused to donate $15,000 to Danni's Gender Justice League. But more on that, I just want to look for a minute at some of Danni's other lies.
So when we think about where our movement started, we really think about a grassroots revolution in some ways, a very community-based revolt against norms around gender and sexuality. And the people who were at the forefront of that movement were often people of color, low-income people, trans folks who had were the most targeted but also had the least to lose in fighting back. That's the place that our community started 40 years ago.
Okay, 2 things about this. It takes very little research to discover on Wikipedia that transgender research and activism was mostly kicked off by a millionaire, a trans man, named Reed Erickson in 1963. In 1964, he launched the Erickson Educational Foundation, EEF, a nonprofit, philanthropic organization funded and controlled entirely by Erickson. The EEF's stated goals were to provide assistance and support in areas where human potential was limited by adverse physical, mental, or social conditions, or where the scope of research was too new, controversial, or imaginative to receive traditionally oriented support. Through the EEF, Erickson contributed millions of dollars to the early development of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer movements between 1964 and 1984. In addition to philanthropy, the EEF functioned as an information and counseling resource for transsexuals, creating a referral network of physicians and psychologists, published educational pamphlets for transsexuals and their families, and conducted outreach to medical professionals, clergy, law enforcement personnel, and academics. More specifically, Erickson funded the Johns Hopkins Center. During the years 1964 to 1970 and 1972 to 1975 alone, the EEF donated approximately US $250,000 to the support of projects about transsexualism. In particular, the Harry Benjamin Foundation received over $60,000 during 1964 to 1968, and the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic received approximately $72,000 during the formative years of 1967 to 1973. Now, this is important because Johns Hopkins' former chief of psychiatry, Paul McHugh, is being villainized as being anti-trans or trying to stifle knowledge and information that will help the trans people, when in fact, funded by a millionaire, he was the pioneer, and they continue to ignore his advice. Now, one of the things that McHugh might have predicted is that Erickson's life didn't turn out that well, even though Erickson had access to all the surgery and was a millionaire. Later in life, he moved to Southern California. By the time of his death in 1992, at the age of 74, he had become addicted to illegal drugs and died in Mexico as a fugitive from US drug indictments. Now, I doubt that Danni was too busy doing activism to actually find out the truth about his own movement. It just doesn't sound as well to say it started with a millionaire than to say it started with black trans women and living in poverty. That's a much better oppression story. And actually, and this is kind of interesting, the reason that he's saying that it started there is because one of the events that the trans people tried to steal as a trans moment was the Stonewall riots. This became a huge deal. A film was made about the Stonewall riots in 2015. Stonewall was the name of an inn where gay men, lesbians, and the occasional transvestite would hang out in New York in the 1960s. They were constantly raided by police, and one night in 1969, the locals decided to not get in the paddy wagon. This was part of a series of events that were significant in mobilizing the LGBT rights community, but trannies wanted to boycott the film in 2015, claiming that it was mostly poor black trannies throwing the bricks at the cops. They said that the LGBT community was trying to cis-wash the events at Stonewall. Now, this resulted in a huge, really gay fight that ultimately resulted in a petition called Drop the T from LGBT. All right, so one of the reasons given is that for the LGs and Bs, it's a different battle. They just want to be free to sleep with whomever they choose. But for the Ts, they want to be free to, at public expense, take hormones that don't belong in their natural body and have access to a butcher who can cut off body parts that are totally healthy. So these are a little bit different of a battle, right? That one is just leave me alone, and the other is give me things. But beyond that, they actually keep trying to convince us that their brain is somehow in the wrong body. And that's just ridiculous. It's not the body that's wrong, it's a problem with the brain.
It's like the lefters at home being like, let's see what crazy thing we can make people say they believe in today, just because we can, you know? What is the craziest, most insane, most counterintuitive, most like medically impossible, most ridiculous thing we can come up with and make everyone believe it and say they believe it, because if they don't, they'll lose their jobs. I know, tranny's perfect.
So what is Danni really up to?
In that time, we have shifted drastically as a movement to one that is heavily funded, almost $1 billion a year. If you look at all LGBT organizations across this country and the amount that they've raised every year, it's almost $1 billion.
Yes, it's about the money. And here's what Danni figures was spent just on the marriage equality bill.
We've spent well over $2 to $3 billion in our fight for marriage equality as a movement. Huge sums of money over a decade.
But do trans people actually even care about something as fundamental as the right to marriage? Here's what poster boy Bruce Jenner had to say about it. And actually, Joe Rogan does an awesome impression.
I'm a traditional girl.
All right, so Bruce doesn't care about it. What about Danni? Does Danni actually care about the fundamental right to gay marriage?
But this approach has been largely a reformist effort, meaning we haven't sought to structurally change the way our culture thinks about gender and sexuality. We haven't interrogated why marriage, why is that the approach, why should the state be involved in sanctioning our relationships. Largely our movement has said we want that too.
So should we keep the T in LGBT? Here's what Danni has to say.
Gender justice is kind of an approach that I think has been forming and bubbling in the trans community over the last decade. Our movement has moved alongside the largely gay and lesbian movement. We call it the LGBT movement for political purposes.
And Danni knows that they should actually part ways.
But largely they're two separate movements moving together in the same direction with a lot of overlap. But our approach in the trans community has started to diverge, and there's a significant reason as to why. The approach that we've taken has largely focused on these reformist efforts for change, and who they have benefited has not largely been trans people.
And that's because you're all nutters.
I very firmly believe that we will look back on this period in time, like we do now on Victorian electroshock therapy, and wonder how we could ever have been so monstrously callous as to allow these people who have mental illnesses to mutilate their bodies.
What the fuck ever happened to loving yourself? That's what confuses the shit out of me.
This is what I'm telling you. It's self-harm extended out into the rest of your life because you didn't pick up a razor blade when you were 15.
Well, the Gender Justice League, aside from having a ridiculous name, has a few really large words to explain themselves.
So the approach of gender justice, as I conceive it, and this is largely informed by other trans activists and analysis that comes from critical race theory, anti-colonialist theory, feminist theories over the last 40 years, gay and lesbian studies, queer studies, trans theory, is one that is very intersectional. It integrates a lot of different approaches and works to dismantle and interrogate what has become what we call now the nonprofit industrial complex. This idea that the only way to create cultural and social change is to do so through a legitimate institution like a nonprofit.
Well, and the funny thing here is that Gender Justice League is actually now a non-profit. Is there anything Danni won't lie about? So this protection order was filed about 6 months after they separated their residences because Danni decided to run for political office. And in response, Frank put up a website exposing the true character of Danni Askini. The only way that Danni could figure to get this offline was to go to the police and file a false report about assault and sexual assault, and one that would get Frank deported. But it didn't take down the website. If you have any doubts whether or not Danni was truly afraid of Frank, well, he actually at one point, after they split up, asked Frank if he could stay on his medical plan to get bottom surgery, and as a lure, offered Frank access to the shiny new vagina. Luckily, and for good reason, Frank was grossed out and refused.
But let's take another trans person, right? Somebody who's had everything. Somebody who now has one of those hideous, oozing, inverted vaginas. You know, the surgery is horrific, by the way. I would describe it in detail to anybody thinking of having this done to them.
So how dishonest does Danni get?
And so gender justice is a focus that is based on creating culture change through new institutions and that is focused on supporting the people at the core of our movements.
No, Danni's only focus is on what's good for Danni. Frank was a vulnerable bisexual man, one of the core members of Danni's group. And what happens? 3 years of mental, emotional, and financial abuse before Danni finally tosses him to the curb. Instead of apologizing to Frank and making things right, Danni pretty much forced him out of the country. You know, one of the things that has changed with the transgender movement is that now a man in a dress can just as easily have a dude thrown in jail as a real woman can.
You're a man in a dress.
Where we've been subjected to sexual assault and violence, apathy by institutions and organizations. Instead, we're finding community-based solutions to solve these problems.
Oh, but you can. Danni easily got this protection order. Police didn't investigate. Frank gave hundreds of pages of documentation to the courts, including even a GPS tracker that showed where he was at all times while he was being accused of assault. He had text messages, he had emails, he had way more than the average person could possibly come up with, and they still arrested him. He ended up fleeing back to Germany because he couldn't protect himself against
a man in a dress.
And a huge number of us will be targeted for violence, sexual assault, and domestic violence.
It is an insult to real rape victims to lie about rape. It undermines issues of credibility, and it also causes us to have to doubt the statistics. Activists should not undermine their own cause.
Many trans folks get pushed out because our ideas are considered too radical, or we're considered too fringe, or we're not considered reasonable in our approaches to what we're demanding and asking for.
Now, I expect part of the problem here is that gender dysphoria has an extremely high rate of comorbidity. One study found over 50% of the people in the study had narcissistic personality disorder. I think they need to do more studies looking at NPD because I sure see a lot of it in the trans community. We should also look at treating other disorders before gender dysphoria is taken seriously.
is
Gender is a social construct.
unless
Milo.
you're trans, in which case
Yes.
you've got a male brain, a female body. What a load of crap. These people really expect us to believe this shit. They think that we have the same level of cognitive dissonance that they have.
So, what do I think Danny needs to do? First of all, I think because he stole the donor database from Equal Rights Washington, he should probably restore all of that diverted funding. Second, remove the fraudulent protection order against Frank Reese. 3, seek counseling. Oh yeah, and stop giving people chlamydia. Gender Justice League. Where's the justice for Frank Reese? Oh yeah, one final message for Danny Askini. And I know you don't want to hear it, but you have to.
You're a man in a dress.
Actually, you're a con man in a dress. No more lies, Brandon.